People today, they called you king. They think you are a messiah.
Who do you think I am? Whoever believes in me shall never die. You are the Son of God.
What if he's not the one? We're risking our lives. For what? What is that?
It's Jesus!
Your hunger for righteousness will be filled through me.
Do you both believe in a historical Jesus?
Jesus is real. History clearly proves that Jesus is real if you're looking at the Bible or if you're not. But what I believe is that he actually did perform the miracles he performed because he actually is divine. Christians did not fill in the information in between the historical events that we know to be true. Christians took the basic historical facts and colored in the space in between. They created the idea of who they wanted to believe in and not what was actually historically real. Jesus was fully man, as the Christians believed, and there's plenty of evidence to prove that much. So Christians did not create the idea of who they wanted to believe in, because if you look at the Bible and from other sources from this time, you can see that the Christians in that time expected Jesus to come in riding on, a white horse and conquer, take over the Romans and free them from any oppression that was going on at that time. And Jesus clearly didn't do that. He came in as a servant and served people. And so we really didn't create the ideal God and Savior to believe in. And it's not just an idea that we've created. Jesus is not. Christians took the information from history about Jesus and filled in the space in between the actual historical events with things like miracles.
Do you believe in miracles such as the resurrection?
Jesus is real and history clearly proves that. But he did not actually perform the miracles that most Christians believe.
Alright, so what's our next question?
Our next question? I think that might be, why is what Christians believe about historical Jesus incorrect?
In the book The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, he talks, it's an interview between a skeptic and a Christian, and he's talking about the historical events that happened in the Bible, and he says, is it authentic or has it been doctored through the years by people favorable to Jesus? This is what has happened. Think of it, there's many different ways to think of it, but one way to think of it is like telephone. Whenever you're playing the game telephone, you start out with one word and you end up with something completely different. Even if it's similar, it's not the original word. And this is how the Christians have altered historical Jesus.
Abby said this one was important, so listen up. How do the New Testament Gospels give neither a full or objective picture?
The New Testament Gospels give neither a full or objective picture. The Gospels are attempts by ancient believers to give an account of the faith in a way that would produce faith among their contemporaries. So basically the New Testament Gospels are written with the purpose of converting more people to Christianity, and so they're altered a little bit. The miracles are made to look better so that people will want to become Christians. After really looking into it and doing a lot of research, including comparing the New Testament Gospels with other sources that are not contained in the Bible, other historical sources from this time, only that's when you can really find a true picture of historical Jesus.
How is Mark 16 evidence towards a skeptic point?
Is the last book in Mark, and since Mark was written first, you can assume that it's the most historically accurate gospel because it was written the closest to the events that actually happened. It's the most original. If the second half of Mark 16 was added later, so the second half of that book is a lot less historically accurate than the first half. If the second half had not been added, then it would not include the resurrection at all and mark the most original and most accurate of the Gospels. So we can assume that the resurrection was information that was added on later by Christians who wanted to have a God to believe in after Jesus was killed. So you talked about the end of Mark 16, and how it's the most original, the most reliable, which isn't necessarily true. You don't have any proof for assuming that it is the most reliable. And it doesn't talk about the resurrection. The resurrection information is added later, but we can assume that it's added. It is supposed to be assumed. When you read Mark, you are supposed to assume the resurrection happened, and because there was miscommunication, like your point where you don't believe in the resurrection and you don't believe that it happened, that's why that information was added on later, for the people who did not assume that the resurrection happened, but it was implied throughout Mark.
Which do you believe is more accurate, history books or the Bible?
So everything that we know about Jesus' miracles is from the Bible, and that is not a very accurate source because it was written so far after when the events actually happened. And history books, which do not talk about Jesus' miracles, are a lot more accurate than the Bible because for history books, we have things like primary sources, people who were there, who lived during that time, who talked to those historical people who saw those events firsthand, and they were able to write about this, and so that information is a lot more accurate than the information in the Bible. So you talked a lot about how the Bible is not all that accurate because it wasn't written that close to the historical events that happened. Well, actually, the Bible is written the closest to the historical events that happened than any other history book from history at that time. So the Bible is really an accurate source for those events that happened. Also, you quoted A Case for Christ. You said, is it authentic or has it been doctored through the years by people favorable to Jesus? So you talked a lot about how history books are more accurate than the Bible, which I already said is not completely true because the Bible was written closer to the events than any other any other history book was written to the events at that time. But also, we can assume that the Bible is accurate because of what I said about the four Gospels matching up, and also it matches up with Josephus' account of what he wrote objectively about that time period.
How can a source that has been copied so many times be reliable?
Historical books were written directly after the historical event happened, right? So that makes them more accurate than the Bible. In A History of God by Armstrong, he talks about this concept of the Bible being written farther after the events that happened, and he says, the first full account of Jesus' life was in St. Mark's Gospel, which was not written until the year 70, some 40 years after his death. In The Case for Christ, in a second interview the author has with a Christian, he says, But what eyewitness accounts do we possess? Do we have the testimony of anyone who personally interacted with Jesus, who listened to his teachings, who saw his miracles, and who perhaps even encountered him after his alleged resurrection? Do we have the records from any first-century journalists who interviewed eyewitnesses, asked tough questions, and faithfully recorded what they determined to be true? Since the Bible has been copied and copied, the story has probably been altered slightly from retelling it through many different people. Armstrong talks about this in his book, A History of God, and he says, by this time, historical facts may have been overladen by mythological elements, which is probably true because stories change and get altered depending on whose perspective they're seen from, and so on. Jesus' life parallels others from ancient history, so how is he unique? There are parallels between Jesus and others from ancient history as a way of demonstrating that his claims and deeds were not completely unique. That's a way of looking at it. It's from The Case for Christ, whenever he's interviewing a Christian, and I think that's interesting because you can look at other people at this time and you can prove that Jesus wasn't one of a kind, which does not make him unique like a son of God, which he would have been if he was in fact the son of God and had completed these miracles. He would have been very unique, when really, if you compare his life to other historical figures from the time, he was not unique at all. So, assuming that the Bible is not true and that people were retelling this story, to make themselves look better, leaving out details conveniently or adding in details to make themselves look better, assuming that you're saying that the disciples are doing this, why would the disciples die, go all the way, get killed in terrible ways for something that they knew wasn't true? Look at Peter. He got crucified upside down, a terrible way to die, for something that he believed in sincerely, and you cannot assume that he just altered the story, told about Jesus' miracles, to make it sound a little bit better. You can't assume that, because then he wouldn't have gone all the way to death for that. He would have said, that this isn't true before that point.
I don't know about you, but I wouldn't die for something I don't believe in. Can you tell me who this is?
Now, you talked a lot about how we only have one source from this. The Christians only have one source, which is the Bible. But actually, we do have a couple other sources. Josephus was a writer from around the time of Jesus, and he wrote about Jesus' life. So that really does give us another source into what happened in Jesus' life. You defined historical Jesus in a way that I believe is correct. The difference that I would add is that, yes, he did perform these miracles, and that is because he's divine, he's God's son. Josephus took an objective viewpoint when he recorded these events, so we can assume that they are accurate. Also, they do match up with the Bible, and they match up with the Bible, and so we can assume that they are true. So, back to Josephus. I've been talking about him and saying that he's a source outside of the Bible for these historical events that happened in Jesus' life. So, he lived around the same time the Bible was written. So, a first century description of the life of Jesus of Nazareth outside of Christian literature is the concise but controversial account found in the Jewish Antiquities of Josephus. This is by Goldberg. Although potentially of great importance, this account appears to resemble Christian beliefs too closely to be the authentic work of a Jewish writer. That's kind of the skeptic's view on what Josephus wrote, is that because it's assumed by all historians, or by most historians, to be historically accurate, and it so closely reflects the Bible, that they're saying it must not be historically accurate. But that goes back to my point on casting doubt. If you cast doubt on something like that, on that historical event, those historical writings that are not even the Bible, you have to cast doubt on any other historical writings around this time. So it's very hard to know what is real and what is not.
Have Christians exaggerated the facts?
Oftentimes we talk about and retell events, but conveniently protect ourselves by leaving out or forgetting details, or even adding in new details or altering details. We exaggerate sometimes. Also, sometimes we see an event or we hear a story about an event and we misunderstand it, and the meaning gets changed in the process of the retelling. This is similar to the Bible because over many years it has been copied and copied and copied, and I really don't think that we can base our evidence on that because it is not an accurate source because of this. An example of this is in Monsters, Inc. when the kid Boo escapes from the factory and she's running around in the restaurant. She escapes from Sully's little bag and she's running around in the restaurant, and they finally get her and they take her away. But the next day they're interviewing people who were at the restaurant, and one of the guys there tells this crazy story about what happened, which was not actually true, but he was trying to make himself look in the best light.
Well, a kid flew right over me and blasted a car with its laser vision.
I tried to run from it, but it picked me up with its mind powers and shook me like a dog.
It's true. I saw the whole thing.
It is my professional opinion that now is the time to panic.
How do we know that in the course of writing down the facts that the Bible consists of, that are in the Bible, the information didn't get changed or new information added in? So, say someone's telling a story about an event that happened. They're going to tell that story so that they look the best if they're telling it to you. So it might not be the exact story of what actually happened. So you talked about how the information in the Bible is not all that credible because the story could have been reworded or made to look better from the different people's perspectives, which is possible, which is true, but there's 4 Gospels and they are all written from different people's perspectives, and especially Luke, which includes lots of different accounts but stories from lots of different people all tied together, and they all match up on a lot of main points about Jesus' life. So even though it's a story told 4 different ways, we get the main idea, the main message of the story, and it does talk about Jesus' miracles. So you talked a lot about how people could forget details conveniently to make themselves look better when they're retelling the story of the Bible or copying it or whatever, right? Well, if you cast this kind of doubt onto the Bible, then you have to cast the same kind of doubt onto other historical events like Julius Caesar or the Egyptians or really any other history that happened around this time. You can't assume that history is exactly accurate either if you assume that Jesus' life is not. What proof do you have of Julius Caesar living or even doing any of these things that he is said to have done at this time? So summing up my points and speaking for most skeptics of historical Jesus, the Christians have taken the historical facts that we know to be true from history, and they have filled in between these facts and these dates with miracles which did not actually happen, which are not actually true. The only source that they have for these miracles is the Bible, which we can not really assume is accurate because history books are much more accurate than it. Also, the story of what happened in Jesus' life could have been altered or changed depending on who told it and what perspective it was seen from. So basically summing up all of what the Christians' belief is on historical Jesus. Christians did not take the basic historical facts and fill in the information in between. Jesus was, of course, a real person. History proves that clearly. And he did perform the miracles that he was said to perform. He did resurrect from the dead. So you gave the telephone example about how you start with a word and then the word is different, and even if it is similar, it's different. Well, that applies, but imagine playing 4 games of telephone all with the same word and coming out with the same word at the end, because the 4 Gospels so closely relate to each other in many facts that we can assume that they are accurate and true because they're written by 4 different people and they match up. And if you assume that, if you just cast out on the Bible or on Josephus or Jesus' life from these accounts, you really have to cast out on any other writings that happened around this time, which really is, so it's hard to say, did Julius Caesar actually do these amazing things, or other historical events like that? The skeptics' basis for assuming that miracles aren't true is not very strong. That's kind of like me saying there's no way that anyone could kill 6 million people in a concentration camp. I can say, I don't believe that that's true. That's not possible. And then I can look at the Holocaust and I can say, well, because I assume that people can't kill 6 million Jews, I can assume that the Holocaust is not real. That's like skeptics. They say, well, miracles aren't real. I assume that miracles aren't real. But I assume that miracles aren't real, so Jesus' life therefore must not be real, which is not a good basis for making an assumption.